On December 23, 1823, an unusual little poem appeared in the New York paper The Troy Sentinel. Its author was unnamed, but the verse and content were so compelling that it was swiftly picked up and published by other papers across the country, creating a Christmas sensation. The poem had been submitted by Sarah Sackett, who had in turn received it from her friend Harriet Butler, but Butler hadn't written the catchy little poem titled simply The Visit. The tale, set in verse so clever that it was easily memorized by the youngest child, had been born at the desk of a well-known professor of Greek and Hebrew literature, where it sat in his family estate on 33 acres in Manhattan. The scholarly man, whose father was the president of Columbia College and the bishop of the Protestant Episcopal Church of New York, sat tapping his pen absently against a sheet of writing paper as he envisioned his fanciful story. It was meant to be a Christmas present with which he would surprise his 6 children, and he fancied that he should get it just right. He had previously read his friend Washington Irving's book, which had been reprinted in the last year, called A History of New York, written under his pseudonym Diedrich Knickerbocker, and had begun to imagine a character that he thought would captivate his children's imaginations. The main character of his imagined poem was not original either, as he was a favorite of the Dutch, who had a rather large representation in New York, and his person had elicited an enthusiastic following of fans who had started clubs, written newsletters, thrown parties, and who had been written of often in the past. But none of those colorful stories were quite like this one. The professor could see the object of his story so clearly that it was as if the jovial man stood before him beside his lively crackling fireplace, and he knew exactly what he would do next. So in clever rhyme he began to flesh out his poem, his pen scratching out the words, "'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse." On Christmas Eve of the following year, the notably serious Clement found himself standing in the midst of his guests, who had gathered in his ancestral home, Chelsea House, for a Christmas party. As the small crowd quieted their laughter and good-natured encouragement for him to begin, he read the cheery little poem he had gifted his little ones aloud, to the great delight of the group. So entranced was one guest by the story that she asked to be able to copy his poem down for herself. Clement agreed, and the excited Miss Butler took home her own copy of the poem, which brought St. Nicholas to life with its colorful descriptives and engaging mannerisms applied to the Dutch Sinterklaas of tradition. The listener could hardly help but picture the jolly old elf lying his finger alongside his merry nose, in a trait borrowed directly from Washington Irving's previous work, in which St. Nicholas was seen in a dream by the wealthy Dutch colonist Olaf van Kortlandt just before he rose into the night sky. But the man who would be responsible for writing and publishing the first Hebrew lexicon in America had no notion that this poem had a bigger future ahead than to simply be sequestered to Chelsea House and the enjoyment of a few close friends and the author's children. St. Nicholas was barely known of in America at the time, with the notable exception of the old Dutch communities. But with the poem being published repetitively at Christmas time, the tradition was being happily embraced. Still, Moore, who thought being known for a frivolous child's verse would not give him the air of dignity needed as a theological scholar and professor of literature, did not take credit for the piece of prose on everyone's lips each Christmas. Until, in 1837, William Cullen Bryant attributed the poem to Moore in his Anthology of American Poetry, and then once again in the same year, poet and editor Charles Finno Hoffman also published the poem in the New York Book of Poetry, claiming Moore as its author. Moore, for his part, remained silent. And then, in 1844, the poem was published in the Washington National Intelligencer under someone else's name. This would never do. While Moore was okay with an anonymous billing, having the now famous poem incorrectly attributed no longer sat well with him. He corrected this by immediately including The Visit in his own book of poems published that year. Finally, the few lines of verse describing a visit from St. Nicholas, penned for the amusement of his children, was now recognized and embraced by its own author. And the world had their answer to who had cleverly etched a vision in the conscious minds of culture of the jolly old elf so lively and quick that its witness knew in a moment he must be St. Nick. Well, almost. In Poughkeepsie, the family of Henry Livingston, a poet and veteran of the Revolutionary War, who had died 9 years before, claimed that he was the author of the popular little verse, not more. And despite having no evidence to connect their relation to the poem directly, they continued to argue their version of its authorship for a century and a half. At this point, it should be noted that we do not have the time or energy to lay out the lengths to which both sides of this rather strange argument have gone to in order to prove their own version of the story. Suffice it to say, there are folks who have investigated this supposed crime, or not, with the thoroughness of forensic scientists. Santa Claus scholars have been called in to give testimony alongside handwriting specialists and experts of literature. The matter has been thoroughly studied, right down to analyzing the Dutch spelling and use of the names Dunder and Bliksem, meaning thunder and lightning in the original poem, which were written as Donder and Blitzen in copies that Moore handwrote as gifts later in his life. Now, we don't mean to harp on a subject, but here we may have to. Once again, we're struck that no one mentioned Santa Claus Scholar as a possible career path in our career day in school, as obviously some of us would have jumped on that sleigh without any hesitation. However, one supposes that the world can't keep spinning with 8 million Santa Claus scholars and one guy doing all the rest of the work. So maybe this was a good decision after all. Anyway, Clement Clark Moore's stack of physical evidence far outweighs the alternatives, and he continues to be credited for the little poem that so captivatingly embodies the holiday season, with its charming depiction of St. Nicholas, which delighted not just his own children that long ago Christmas of 1821, but also millions of imaginations ever since. We hope you enjoyed today's Christmas video Advent calendar opening, and that if you did, you'll take a moment and click the like button, comment, and even share it with friends and family who also might enjoy it, as you help our channel continue to grow. Now, go prepare your shutters and sash for the big night when you will need to be quick to catch a glimpse of good old St. Nick, and we'll see you later.